You always check the locks when you rent an Airbnb. You make sure the front door is secured, the windows are bolted, and the curtains are tightly drawn against the dark night. But what if the person you are locking out is already locked inside with you? I want you to imagine a place so far off the grid that the silence outside is almost deafening. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a chance to escape the noise of the city and breathe in the cold, damp air of the remote countryside. I packed a single bag, grabbed my dog, and drove for 4 hours into the deep woods. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown: rustic, charming, and utterly isolated. The heavy wooden beams gave it a sense of history, while the sprawling layout made it feel much larger than a typical vacation rental. The first night went by in a blur of unpacked bags and a warm cup of tea by the fireplace. The rain had started around dusk, a slow, rhythmic tapping against the thick glass windows. It was a comforting sound at first, the kind of sound that lulls you into a deep, peaceful sleep. I felt safe. I felt hidden away from the world. But that illusion of safety is a fragile thing. It only takes one small, unexplainable detail to shatter it completely. I thought the isolation was a luxury, until my dog started staring at the blank wall beneath the stairs. It began on the second evening. The rain had escalated from a gentle drizzle to a torrential downpour, masking any sounds from the woods outside. I was sitting on the couch, the dim light from the television casting long, distorted shadows across the living room floor. My dog, a usually energetic and vocal golden retriever, was sitting completely still near the bottom of the wooden staircase. At first, I did not think much of it. Dogs hear things we cannot. Perhaps it was a mouse in the walls, or the old house settling under the weight of the storm. But as the minutes ticked by, her behavior grew increasingly bizarre. She was not just listening. She was fixated. Her eyes were locked onto a specific spot where the staircase met the floorboards, a dead end covered in faded floral wallpaper. I called her name. She did not flinch. It was as if she was paralyzed by whatever was holding her attention. I muted the television, letting the heavy silence of the house wash over me. The only sound was the relentless rain and the creaking of the floorboards above. I walked over to her, my bare feet sinking into the thick rug. I knelt down and placed my hand on her back. She was trembling. A violent, rigid shudder was passing through her entire body. My heart gave a slight, uneasy flutter. I looked at the wall, but there was nothing there. Just peeling paper and solid wood. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the unfamiliar environment, and decided to take her for a quick walk outside before the storm got worse. When we came back inside, shaking off the cold rain, I unclipped her leash and tossed it onto the lower steps of the staircase. I turned away for just a second to hang up my damp coat. That was when I heard it. A sharp, metallic clinking sound, followed by the heavy slap of nylon against wood. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The leash, which had been lying completely flat just a second ago, was now violently jolting upwards. It flung itself into the air in a quick, erratic motion, as if an invisible hand had yanked it from above. It hovered for a fraction of a second before slapping back down onto the step. I stood there, frozen. My mind raced to find a logical explanation. A draft, a sudden gust of wind, but the windows were sealed shut, and the heavy air in the house was completely stagnant. There was no breeze. There was no logical reason for the leash to move. I felt a cold bead of sweat form on my forehead. My dog immediately backed away from the stairs, a low, guttural growl vibrating in her chest. She began to obsessively sniff the edge of the rug near the bottom step, her nose pressed hard against the small gap between the fabric and the floor. She started scratching, her claws clicking frantically against the hardwood, desperate to dig into something that was not there. I slowly approached the stairs, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the leash. It felt unnaturally cold. I looked up the dark, empty stairwell, expecting to see a shadow, a figure, anything. But there was only darkness. I tried to convince myself that my eyes were playing tricks on me, that the shadows from the television had created an optical illusion. But deep down, a primal instinct was screaming at me. Something was terribly wrong. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt thicker, heavier, and charged with an unseen tension. The silence was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old house, unaware that the true nightmare was just about to begin. There was no draft in the house, yet the cold air blowing from behind the wallpaper smelled like damp earth and sweat. The morning light did little to ease the heavy dread that had settled in my stomach. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, overcast sky that barely illuminated the living room. My dog had not slept. She spent the entire night pacing near the bottom of the staircase, occasionally letting out a low, anxious whine. I tried to go about my morning, making a cup of coffee, forcing down a piece of dry toast, but my eyes kept darting back to that dark corner. I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sensation was entirely physical, a prickling heat on the back of my neck, making the fine hairs stand up in alarm. I decided I needed to understand what was driving my dog crazy. I convinced myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a feral cat trapped under the floorboards seeking shelter from the rain. I grabbed my phone, turning on the bright flashlight, and walked slowly over to the spot where my dog was standing guard. I crouched down, bringing my face close to the wooden baseboard. The faded floral wallpaper was peeling slightly at the edges, revealing the dark, untreated wood underneath. I ran my fingers along the seam, feeling for a gap, a crack, anything that could explain the strange, persistent draft. As I pressed against the wall, the wood gave way ever so slightly with a soft, hollow thud. It was not a solid, structural wall. I pushed a little harder, my heart rate rapidly accelerating in my chest. The wallpaper ripped, creating a dry, tearing sound that echoed sharply in the quiet house. I peeled back a large, brittle strip of the paper, the harsh light from my phone illuminating what lay hidden beneath the disguise.
How long
It
has
was a
this
door,
been here?
a small, square wooden
There's
door,
something back here.
barely
I don't
3
like
feet
this.
high, blending perfectly into the paneling under the stairs. It had a dull brass doorknob, tarnished with age and covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The space beneath the stairs was not solid. It was a room, and my dog had not been staring at the stairs themselves. She had been staring directly at this hidden door. A sudden, violent shiver ran down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. I leaned in closer, my phone trembling uncontrollably in my hand. That was when the smell hit me. It seeped through the tiny cracks in the rotting wood.
There's
A
nothing but
foul,
darkness
metallic
inside.
odor of damp earth, old decay, and stale, unwashed sweat. It was the undeniable scent of something living in a confined space. I held my breath, terrified that even the sound of my own lungs expanding would give away my presence to whatever was inside. I pressed my ear gently against the cold, rough wood of the small door, straining to hear past my own racing heartbeat. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing, just the deafening silence of the isolated cabin. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, barely a whisper in the dark, a wet, ragged, wheezing breath. It was slow and highly deliberate, inhaling and exhaling with a heavy, labored rhythm. It was not an animal. It was human, and it was right on the other side of the thin wooden panel, mere inches from my face. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly weak and completely useless. I hit the floor hard, scrambling away from the door, my eyes wide with unadulterated terror. My dog began to bark frantically, a sharp, aggressive sound that tore through the oppressive silence of the room. I tried to grab her collar, to physically pull her away from the danger, but she was lunging aggressively at the small doorway. I had locked the front door. I had locked all the windows. I had checked every visible room before going to sleep. But I had never checked inside the walls. And then, the absolute most terrifying thing of all happened. Slowly, deliberately, with a chilling metallic squeak,
The door
the
began to
dull
open
brass doorknob
precisely at
began to turn.
3:14.
The slow rotation of that tarnished metal was the most horrifying thing I had ever witnessed. It rotated a quarter of an inch, then half an inch, the internal mechanism clicking loudly and clearly in the quiet room. Someone was wrapping their hand around the handle from the inside. Someone was actively trying to open the door and step out into my living room. I was completely paralyzed by fear. My brain screamed at me to run, to grab my car keys and sprint out of the house, but my body refused to obey the command. I watched in horrified fascination, unable to blink, as the knob finally stopped turning, followed by the soft, agonizingly slow creak of the door inching open, revealing a vertical sliver of pitch-black darkness. I dropped my phone into the dark gap, and right before it hit the ground, the screen illuminated a pale, dirt-covered hand reaching up to catch it. The light from my phone spun wildly as it slipped from my sweaty fingers, tumbling down into the unseen depths of the hidden basement. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. I watched the glowing rectangular screen flip over and over, illuminating brief, chaotic flashes of rough wooden steps, a dirt floor, and then the hand. It was an impossibly long, emaciated arm, the skin a sickly, translucent white, caked in dried mud and grime. The fingers were unnaturally spindly, the nails long and jagged. It shot out from the black void with terrifying speed, snatching my phone right out of the air before it could hit the bottom. The screen immediately went completely dark, plunging the narrow opening back into absolute, impenetrable blackness. I stopped breathing. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. My brain was desperately trying to process the impossible reality of what I had just seen, but my body was already reacting to the sheer primal terror. A violent wave of nausea washed over me, and my legs, which had been frozen just moments before, suddenly surged with an overwhelming rush of adrenaline. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against the rough fibers of the rug, desperately trying to put distance between myself and that dark, gaping hole in the wall. My dog was going absolutely berserk now, a continuous stream of aggressive, terrifying barks that echoed deafeningly in the small living room. She was snapping her jaws at the empty air, her body positioned between me and the door, fiercely protecting me from whatever was lurking down there. Then, the auditory nightmare began. From the absolute pitch-black depths of that hidden space, a sound emerged that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. It was a wet, heavy, scraping noise, like flesh and muddy fabric dragging violently against rough wood. It was the sound of someone, or something, rapidly climbing up the stairs. It was not a steady, normal gait. It was a frantic, scrambled movement, a desperate, inhuman rush to reach the top. Thud, drag, thud, drag. The heavy, muddy boots slammed against the hollow steps with an explosive force, causing the floorboards beneath me to vibrate with the sheer power of the impact. The heavy, wheezing breath grew louder, more frantic, echoing violently in the confined space. They were coming up. They were rushing up to the living room. Pure, unadulterated panic completely hijacked my nervous system. I lunged forward, grabbing my dog by the thick fur of her neck, ignoring her desperate attempts to stay and fight. I yanked her backward with all the strength I had left, practically dragging her across the hardwood floor toward the front door. I did not look back. I could not bring myself to look back at that dark corner, terrified that if I turned my head, I would see that pale, muddy face emerging from the darkness, blocking my only path to salvation. My fingers fumbled uselessly with the heavy brass deadbolt. They were slick with cold sweat, slipping over the metal as the heavy, violent footsteps reached the very top of the hidden staircase. The small wooden door was violently kicked open, slamming loudly against the drywall. A massive, dark figure spilled out into the dim light of the living room. I finally managed to twist the lock, ripping the heavy wooden door open and throwing myself out into the freezing, relentless rain. I ran blindly through the thick mud, the icy downpour immediately soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I did not stop running until I reached my car, tearing the door open, shoving my dog inside, and slamming it shut. I frantically locked the doors, my chest heaving violently, gasping for air as if I had been drowning. I fumbled with my keys, shoving them into the ignition, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the metal. As the engine roared to life, casting bright headlights across the muddy driveway, I finally dared to look back at the isolated cabin. The front door stood wide open, a dark, rectangular void against the gray storm. And standing perfectly still in the center of the doorway, illuminated only by the weak yellow glow of the living room lamp, was a tall, impossibly thin silhouette. It just stood there, motionless, watching me, the heavy rain washing over its dark, unidentifiable features. I slammed the car into reverse and sped down the treacherous dirt road, leaving the nightmare behind me. But the true horror, the realization that continues to keep me awake every single night, is not just the fact that I barely escaped. It is the terrifying, lingering question of how long that person had been living in that cramped, dark space beneath the floorboards. How many nights had they laid there in absolute silence, listening to me walk around above them? Did they watch me through the tiny, invisible cracks in the wooden floorboards while I was watching television? Did they stand over me while I was sleeping, their wheezing breath blending with the sound of the rain? The thought is a suffocating, paralyzing dread that I can never seem to shake off. The next time you rent a secluded cabin in the woods, the next time you lock your doors and feel safe and secure from the outside world, remember my story. Listen to the creaks of the floorboards. Pay attention to the sudden drops in temperature. Because sometimes, the most dangerous threats are not waiting outside your house. Sometimes, they are already locked inside with you, waiting patiently in the dark, breathing the very same air. If you have ever experienced something truly unexplainable, or if you have a terrifying encounter that still haunts your dreams, share your story in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe to Lost Horror so I have the motivation to keep uncovering these dark secrets. The story I have for you next week is even more twisted and disturbing than this one, so make sure you stay tuned.